Rome is often remembered as the height of civilization, a world of marble temples, poets, scholars, and philosophers who shaped Western law and culture. But that is only the surface. Behind the statues and libraries stood an invisible engine that powered the empire, a system that treated human beings not as citizens, not even as property, but as livestock. This empire may look like the pinnacle of progress, but it isn't what you think. Because what truly kept Rome thriving was not its armies or its laws, but a breeding system built on the bodies of enslaved women, managed, calculated and controlled with the same cold precision used for cattle. Rome did not simply own people. Rome manufactured them, and this was not a side practice hidden in some distant corner of society. It was the foundation that quietly sustained the empire for centuries. If Rome didn't control reproduction this way, the entire slave economy would have collapsed within a single generation, because supply through conquest was never enough to match demand. That meant the empire's political, economic, and agricultural survival depended on factory-style human breeding. Without it, elite villas would have emptied, urban households would have lost their labor force, and the infrastructure of Roman wealth would have crumbled before it ever reached its golden age. Rome did not just expand through force. It reproduced its workforce like livestock to secure the future of the state. The system did not begin as a formal policy. At first, slaves were simply captured through war, and any children born on estates were considered a lucky bonus for the owner. But over time, Rome's expansion slowed while its hunger for labor kept growing. Wars could no longer supply enough bodies, and the price of fresh captives rose sharply. That is when elite villa owners made a cold calculation. It was cheaper to produce slaves than to purchase them. A woman who could give birth to multiple children was worth more than her own market price. And once this logic took hold, reproduction stopped being accidental and became organized. What had once been a byproduct of slavery was turned into a long-term investment plan. This shift is visible in Roman estate records from the late Republic onward. Wealthy landowners began tracking births, not just labor output, and they started buying young girls specifically for fertility rather than for field work. A captured slave brought short-term value, but a fertile slave brought renewable profit year after year. Villa owners realized they no longer needed to rely on conquest when they could create their own captive workforce from inside their walls. By the 1st century AD, human breeding had become institutional, systematic, and fully integrated into estate economics. Rome no longer waited for war to supply its slaves. It manufactured its own future labor force through calculated reproduction, turning fertility into an industry rather than an accident of life. Once breeding became policy, the body itself turned into a financial asset. Slave women were not recorded as people, but as investments that could yield a lifetime of profit. Estate ledgers calculated how many births a woman could produce across 20 years, the likely survival rate of her children, and the total market value of those children. Fertility became a kind of currency, measured and evaluated the same way a merchant would measure the return on vineyards or livestock. A young woman with a healthy body and proven fertility could generate more income than an entire field of crops. She was treated as a living factory, a long-term investment portfolio that would keep paying out as long as she continued producing children. The records show this logic clearly. Women were priced not for their abilities, but for their reproductive potential. Age, hip width, menstrual regularity, and previous births all raised or lowered their value. Successful breeders received slightly better treatment, not because owners cared about them as humans, but because protecting the asset safeguarded its yield. Even their bodies were depreciated like financial goods, with notes about when they would move from prime reproductive years into reduced productivity. In Roman economics, fertility was not a private matter or a natural function. It was a calculated commodity, assessed and exploited like any other resource the elite could harvest for profit. Once a woman's fertility was recorded, The next step was pairing her with a selected male, not for companionship or marriage, but for controlled reproduction. Owners matched men and women the same way animal breeders matched horses or cattle, looking for traits they wanted to repeat in the next generation. A strong laborer was paired with a woman whose family line showed physical endurance. A skilled craftswoman might be bred with a man known for intelligence or quick learning. Beauty, height, temperament, and even voice tone could be considered part of the desirable stock. Male slaves with especially valuable traits were separated from the rest of the population and turned into breeding specialists. Owners called them stallions, and they lived under a different set of rules because their only purpose was to father children with as many women as possible. They received better food and housing, not as reward, but to preserve their reproductive usefulness. Rome was not simply growing a workforce, it was engineering bloodlines, shaping the future slave population with the same precision used in selective livestock breeding. Under this system, humans were reduced to traits, statistics, and biological function. Their bodies turned into tools for producing more bodies in a never-ending cycle of ownership. But none of this could work unless the women themselves were broken first. Rome understood that controlling the body was not enough. They had to control the mind. New female slaves often went through a period the records call domestication, a slow process designed to erase identity and replace it with obedience. They were isolated from others, stripped of their original names, and forbidden from speaking their native language. Everything that connected them to their past, as family, culture, memory, was cut away until they stood alone. Dependent on their captors for even the smallest comfort, starvation was used not as punishment, but as training. Food became a reward for compliance, and hunger became a reminder of who held power. The message was simple. Survival depended on obedience. Sexual submission was also disguised as instruction, presented as a required duty rather than a violation. If a woman resisted, she lost food, rest, or even contact with other people. If she obeyed, she was allowed slightly better conditions. Over time, the mind learned what the body already knew. Resistance meant suffering, compliance meant survival. By the time the breeding program officially began for a woman, her will had already been dismantled. Rome did not just control lives. It rewired identity until the enslaved stopped seeing themselves as daughters, wives, or individuals, and began seeing themselves as breeding stock, made to serve and reproduce on command. The ultimate goal of this system was to create slaves who had never tasted freedom at all. These were called vernae, slaves born directly on the estate rather than captured in war. To Roman owners, they were the perfect product because they required no breaking. They had no memories of another life, no language of their own, no sense of identity outside the villa. From birth, they were raised to see obedience as normal and ownership as natural. A captured adult always carried a hidden threat, the memory of choice. A villa-born child carried none. Vernae were treated like long-term investments, shaped from infancy to fit the role chosen for them. Some were trained for heavy labor, some for skilled crafts, and some for future breeding. Emotional bonds were carefully controlled. Children were taken from their mothers young, so they could grow up loyal to the system, not to their families. This early conditioning worked better than fear because it replaced resistance with belief. A child who was never told he was stolen never learned to dream of escape. For Roman landowners, a verna was more valuable than any soldier's captive because he was not just owned in body, but in mind. The system did not simply reproduce labor, it reproduced loyalty. The public markets made this reality even more brutal because they turned human breeding into a performance. Slave auctions did not simply list age or skill. They displayed reproductive potential the way animal markets displayed livestock. Women were examined in front of crowds, inspected for their hips, teeth, and breasts, and questioned about their menstrual cycles and past pregnancies. These invasive checks were not medical care but economic verification, meant to prove the seller's claims. A woman who had already given birth to healthy children could be sold for a higher price, just like a proven broodmare. Even children were pulled into this display system. Babies and young offspring were sometimes brought on stage as living proof of successful breeding. Their presence increased the value of the mother by showing what kind of products she could produce. Buyers did not see a family. They saw bloodlines, yield rates, and genetic potential. In this world, a womb was not something sacred or private. It was a commodity, publicly judged and priced. Rome's marketplace did not hide its cruelty in shadows. It normalized it under the open sky, turning human life into a public inventory measured by future profit. Roman medicine soon became part of this machinery, turning gynecology into something closer to livestock science than human care. Physicians wrote treatises on how to manage female fertility the way a farmer would manage animal reproduction, focusing on the output of the womb rather than the well-being of the woman. A pregnant slave was not treated as a patient, but as a container for a future asset. Every medical choice served the baby's market value, not the mother's survival. The most shocking evidence of this is the use of early surgical procedures. Roman doctors performed primitive caesarean sections on enslaved women centuries before they were practiced on free citizens. But they did it for one reason only: to save the child, even if it meant the mother died in the process. The woman's life was expendable, but the infant represented profit. Diet and care followed the same pattern. Pregnant slaves received more food only when it improved the strength and size of the unborn child, not because anyone wished to ease the mother's suffering. Nutrition was calculated, dosed, and monitored like feed for an animal herd. Everything came back to the same cold truth. Medicine, which should have protected life, became a tool of exploitation, shaping the body into something useful to the master rather than something belonging to the woman herself. Not every slave accepted this fate. The deepest threat to Rome's breeding machine came from the people trapped inside it, and the greatest example was the uprising led by Spartacus. Most people think his revolt was only about escaping gladiator schools or defeating Roman armies. But the rebels understood something far more dangerous to the empire. If they destroyed the breeding foundations, Rome's slave supply would collapse in the next generation. That is why they did not just free prisoners. They targeted villas, nurseries, medical rooms, and breeding records. They were not only fighting soldiers, they were attacking the roots of Roman power. When rebel forces stormed an estate, they burned ledgers, destroyed maternity chambers, and scattered the children so they could never again be catalogued as future stock. They understood that freedom meant nothing if the system remained intact to create a new generation of the enslaved. Roman commanders reacted with panic, not because of lost land, but because the economic future of their estates was disappearing in flames. Military reports from the period show how urgently Rome moved to recapture breeding centers before reclaiming normal farmland, which reveals the truth nobody wanted to say aloud. The empire cared more about its reproductive infrastructure than its crops or buildings. Spartacus struck at the one place Rome believed was untouchable, and for a brief moment, the system trembled. Modern archaeology has confirmed what ancient texts hinted at, uncovering physical evidence that this system was not rare or symbolic, but widespread and carefully designed. Excavations of villa estates have revealed maternity chambers built separately from regular slave quarters, with layouts focused on controlling pregnant women and monitoring births. These rooms were designed for function, not comfort, close to medical tools, record-keeping areas, and storage for supplies used in reproduction. They were not living spaces. They were production sites. The nurseries are even more revealing. Archaeologists have uncovered buildings structured like early childcare factories, with heating systems, multiple feeding stations, and controlled sleeping areas to raise dozens of infants at once. The architecture shows planning and routine, not improvisation. These were not households caring for babies. These were institutions manufacturing a captive future population. And the darkest evidence lies in the soil itself. Mass infant grave sites found near breeding villas contain the remains of newborns who died during the first months of life, their burials arranged in neat groupings rather than family plots. The scale is staggering. Hundreds of tiny skeletons clustered together tell the story no writer needed to record. High mortality was simply part of the business. The ground has become a witness to what Rome tried to hide, proving that its prosperity was built not only on conquest, but on the systematic harvesting of human life. The story does not end in antiquity, because Rome's blueprint did not die with the empire. It traveled forward through history and shaped future systems of slavery, especially in the colonial era. Plantation owners in the Americas copied Roman logic almost word for word, treating enslaved women as self-replacing labor, calculating birth yields, and breeding people instead of buying them. The idea that a slave population should grow itself was not invented in the 1700s. It was inherited from Roman economic thinking that treated fertility as a renewable resource. The psychological methods survived as well. The destruction of family identity, the forced renaming, the breaking of resistance through starvation and isolation. These are the same tools used by traffickers today, just with new language and new surroundings. What Rome created was not just a labor system, but a mental formula for control, one powerful enough to survive for 2,000 years. Modern human trafficking still follows this pattern: separate, weaken, isolate, then reshape the victim into someone who accepts captivity as normal. When we look at the past, we are not staring at something buried. We are looking into a mirror, seeing the oldest version of a system that still exists in new forms. Built on the same logic Rome perfected, remove the humanity, and the body becomes an asset. Rome is remembered as a cradle of law, architecture, and philosophy. Yet its wealth was built on a system that treated human birth like livestock production. The marble statues and shining forums were only the mask. Beneath them was a machine that turned women into vessels and children into inventory, a system so normal to the Romans that they wrote about it openly, as if it were simple agriculture. When we call Rome great, we are also naming the civilization that perfected the idea that a human body could be planned, managed, and multiplied like a herd. And this is why history matters. Without memory, cruelty repeats itself in different clothing. The world changes its vocabulary, but not its logic. Rome teaches us that injustice does not always appear violent at first glance. Sometimes it arrives wearing order, paperwork, rational planning, and economic language. Sometimes the greatest horrors hide behind words like management, efficiency, and growth. If you found this exploration eye-opening, there is more waiting just beyond this story, because the empire did not invent cruelty. It industrialized it, and many of those methods still echo through modern systems we rarely question. Click on the next video appearing on your screen to keep uncovering the truths that history tried to bury. And if you want these hidden chapters of the past brought back to light, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The story of Rome does not end here. We have only opened the first door. Rome is remembered as a cradle of law, architecture, and philosophy, yet its wealth was built on a system that treated human birth like livestock production. The marble statues and shining forums were only the mask. Beneath them was a machine that turned women into vessels and children into inventory, a system so normal to the Romans that they wrote about it openly, as if it were simple agriculture. When we call Rome great, we are also naming the civilization that perfected the idea that a human